On the programme, we have with us Ben Bradley, Conservative MP for Mansfield, leader of Nottinghamshire County Council. Dane Baptiste is a comedian and podcaster. Richard Sefton is a mental health counsellor and host of the State of Mind podcast. And Iain Nadler is political commentator. And it seems appropriate to mention her book, even though it was published donkeys years ago, wasn't it?
Too Nice to Be a Tory.
Well, I do.
Which I'm delighted
I do,
about,
because it's actually a very, very good book and people should read it. So, questions 0345 6060 973, text 84850 and watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Now, Dane Baptiste, we were hoping to have you live in the studio, but you've gone down with the dreaded lurgy.
Yep. This is a second time round, unfortunately. But after some festivities the previous week, I've been diagnosed, but which seems to be a much more, reduced in its level of virulence. So I'm still able to be there in spirit.
Good.
And also here by Zoom.
Well, I'm glad you're feeling okay. Right, let's go into our first question. It's Stephen in Putney. Hello, Stephen.
Hello there, hi. I'm a sort of floating voter at the general election, and there's only one candidate that I could see that could possibly persuade me to vote Conservative. I wonder if you could kind of guess who that would be.
Well, OK, so you're a floating voter. Who did you vote for at the last election?
Previously, I leaned towards Labour, but didn't vote for Corbyn for obvious reasons, I hope. So
Right.
didn't vote. So voted Labour generally, but not Corbyn.
Well, that's one of our less challenging opening questions, but it's almost like a quiz, isn't it? Richard Sefton, now you are on the left.
I'm going to guess Tom.
You're going to guess Tom. Why do you say that?
Because that's who I would be.
That's it. I'm not sure you would class as a floating voter, though. Iain Nadler, who do you think is...
OK, I'm going to be slightly strategic about this. Did you say you were phoning from Putney?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Putney's got a very high Remain quotient. I think it voted something like 70% of people in Putney voted to stay in the European Union. That said, it's difficult to know which of the candidates would fulfil that interest of yours if indeed you fall into that 70%. So I think maybe Richard's right. But the alternative, I think, would be Kemi Badenoch, because she is so clearly different from the other candidates. And therefore, if you're a floating voter, I think she's the most distinctive character and might be the one who potentially could win over a floating voter.
It is interesting when I look at the texts and tweets that come into the programme. A lot of people, I've got people saying, well, I'm a Labour voter, but if Rishi Sunak was leader of the Tories, I could think about voting for him. Then the next person down will say, well, yeah, I'm a Labour voter, but I'm really impressed by Penny Mordaunt. So it's very difficult to discern the trends here. And Ben Bradley, you are a Kemi Badenoch supporter. Who do you think Stephen's leaning towards?
Well, I'm pleased to hear you say that. I think Kemi's probably the right person. I represent a seat that is lots of former Labour voters who turned Tory in the last kind of 4 or 5 years, and I think she appeals to those people. I think the clear kind of drive around the cultural questions and the bravery that she's shown and all of that, I think it goes down really well with my constituents. They normally talk, say it's a relief to hear somebody talk common sense on some of those things, so I think she'd be great for that. And if I'm honest about which leader do Labour voters prefer, it's not really my problem in some ways. I'm interested in which...
Well, it kind of is,
Tory
actually, surely, because you are in a marginal seat, and therefore you kind of want to know what your Labour voters are thinking, don't you, on this kind of thing?
Well, I think a lot of my voters are small C Conservative in terms of culture. So I think Kemi would appeal. Mansfield's gone from 1,000 majority at the 17 election to 16.5 in 2019.
I take it back. You're not in a marginal seat.
They're more marginal than me, but I think it's off the back of some of the kind of the bits of Boris that they liked, were the straight talking bits where he cut through the crap. And I think Kemi's capable of doing that without some of the less helpful.
Okay. Dane Baptiste, who do you think Stephen might be leaning towards?
In all honesty, I couldn't really understand how someone who considered himself to be a floating voter or gravitated historically towards Labour would be able to make any discernment amongst any of the Tory candidates. So I'm honestly going to say I don't know who you could vote for, because personally myself, who would have historically voted for Labour or the Green Party, I couldn't think of any Tory candidate that's currently in this race worth voting for. So...
But he's a floating voter. The definition of a floating voter means that you do vote for all sorts of different parties over the years.
Yeah, but it's a very hard decision to make when I'm not really assured as to what Steve's objectives would be as a vote or
right.
points.
Okay, Stephen, put us out of our misery.
And I'm a Remainer, but
Sorry, I didn't hear your answer. Just repeat that.
Rishi Sunak, and I'm a Remainer, but I feel that he's not as enthusiastic as the others. Somehow, any more than too enthusiastic, and the Turkey kind of issue, really, I think that was dog whistle and a very bad mark against her. And I just think Rishi is also sceptical on net zero, which I like. So I guess I'm quite unusual, but there's quite a few of us out there who are sick of the left, sick of the right. And I think Rishi, I'm hoping he might be a bit different and be pragmatic.
Well, if he's listening, he'll be very pleased with you. Thank you, Stephen. Let's move on to Janice in Buckingham. It's a text. She says, is Rishi Sunak destined to be Prime Minister, or could someone still swing it? Well, Joanne Nadler, you are a student of Conservative Party history. You've experienced quite a few of these leadership elections over the years. Do you think that... and there's always this thing that, the front runner never wins. Well, Boris Johnson was a front runner and he did win, but often they don't.
Front runner too, though.
Do you think that he? Well, no, there were lots of candidates at the beginning last time, weren't there? But do you think that he's running a campaign that is maybe a little bit risk averse, and that might come back to haunt him?
I think in his favour, he does have the capacity to reach across, as the last caller testified to, really. And I think a lot of Conservative MPs will be asking themselves, which leader will get our seats re-elected and will get us back into government? And so to a certain extent, I think his risk-averse approach is probably playing to his strengths, which are the fact that he presents very well. He could, his strengths are also his weaknesses. You could see him as the leader of a sort of New Labour type of government, and you can also see him as a Conservative leader. He does come across as being very moderate. Not sure whether moderate is the right way to describe him, given the amount of money that he's been spending over the last couple of years and given the effect that it's had on the economy. But I think it's probably a reflection of that and of his economic record, which means it's in his favour to play this campaign quite carefully.
Dane Baptiste, do you think that he is destined to be Prime Minister, or do you think that somebody else could come through and pip him at the post?
I mean, given the current candidates, there doesn't really seem anybody that can necessarily best him at this particular point. I think given that there's been recent revelations that he had already secured a website so far as to his campaign, I think this has been an objective of Rishi Sunak's very early on, irrespective of what's taken place over the last week or so. I think as far back as he was suggesting initiatives such as Eat Out to Help Out, he was already beginning a campaign to endear himself to British laity en masse. And so I think he's been trying to shape his own destiny rather than him just being naturally destined to be...
How is that different from any other politician?
Well, he's got a lot more... he's got a bunch deeper pockets in order to facilitate his campaign. But then, that being said, up until very recently, Rishi Sunak was an American resident, technically. I know that like myself because he very recently had a green card. So I guess he was definitely weighing up his options. But I think he's been in very close proximity to the Prime Minister and has had a lot of visibility amongst the PM more recently. So, I guess he has been involved in kind of shaping his own destiny and kind of poising himself in the right place when all this was going to happen.
Ben Bradley, is that any different from any other leading politician? I mean, if you're in the cabinet, you surely almost automatically think, one day I've got a chance of becoming Prime Minister. So you kind of shape your PR, your whole image, maybe with that in the back of your mind.
I don't know. I think lots of politicians in that position in cabinet will have people who help them do that as well around the scenes. But I think it's really refreshing. I think people like Ben Wallace this week, who I'm told, went home, saw his kids last weekend and said, what's my priority here? I want to spend more time with my kids, actually, and said, I'm not going to run. There are lots of people like that in and around cabinet, and I think we sometimes get a bad name. I know that from my perspective, I can't think of a worse job to do, truthfully, from my point of view. So I don't think...
Says a man who's an MP and a leader of a council.
Well, then the reason that I do that, the precisely reason that I do that, and the reason that I turned around to the Whip's office nearly 2 years ago now and said, I don't want to be a minister, take me off, I resigned and stepped back, is because I'm really passionate about my local area. I want to do things, and rather than stay here and talk, I wanted to have the levers to do, and now I can, and it's quite effective. perspective. So I don't think everybody's in that boat. And it's right that clearly we all know, Rishi hasn't just decided to do this in the last week. But I don't necessarily think that gives him an advantage because to a certain extent, we've heard it. He's been in cabinet. How can you talk for change and really want to do things differently when you've been such a key part of what's gone on before?
I think very importantly, though, it should be noted that he is not the favourite amongst party members based on the polling that we've seen of party members. So to answer the question...
Even though all of his campaign team keep telling us on the media that he is.
Well, I mean, he does have a lot of appeal, for all the reasons that I've said. But the reality is, to answer the question directly, is he destined to be? No, I'm not sure that he is, and he could still be upset, as it were. Those ambitions could be upset, even if he makes it through to the final two, because at the moment he is not, judging on all the polling we've seen of party members, he is not the favourite by some measure.
Do you have a favoured candidate?
Absolutely, Kemi.
Well, we've got a very balanced panel here tonight.
Oh dear.
No, you've got quite a balance.
I'll be having a word with the producers afterwards.
No more of this.
Richard Sefton, let's go back to the question. Is Rishi Sunak destined to be PM or could someone else still swing it?
I don't think he is because, he's a front runner. But if you like you were just saying, if you look at the polls, there's a lot more candidates, Kemi, for example, and Penny, that when it comes down, if it came down to the final two and they were there, that would beat him. I also find it really funny that just a few months ago, people were saying we can't get rid of Boris Johnson because the one that was to replace him was Rishi, and now he can't because of his wife's non-dom's tax, and that's sort of like been forgotten now. And I don't understand why that's been forgotten, why he's front runner. Although I like that there was a very diverse pool, like you said before. I love that. And I love that we could have our first British Asian Prime Minister. But I don't think Rishi would be my pick.
Let's talk for a minute about the mental health aspect of this, because as Ben was saying, Ben Wallace dropping out, not for mental health reasons, but for family reasons. I'm just reading Andrea Ledsam's new book at the moment, Snakes and Ladders, where she talks about the decision that she made in 2016 after the referendum, when she decided to stand, if you remember when Boris Johnson did the dirty on her. And she literally sat her family down and they had the discussion. And, I mean, she essentially says, if my kids had said, I don't want you to do this, she wouldn't have done it. And I don't think people think about those pressures on politicians in this situation, because it's a hugely pressurised thing to want to be leader of your party.
Well, it's a hugely pressurised thing anyway. I've spoken to a couple on the State of Mind podcast. Anna Soubry, the amount of pressure that she had to put up with, standing in a party that was predominantly a Leave party, and standing up, and the amount of abuse that she got outside. To stand and be Prime Minister, you have to kind of accept that nearly half the country is not going to like you. So there's a massive pressure.
But in this days of social media, that almost exaggerates everything, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And we were talking earlier, weren't we, about tribes and how the tribes have become much more exaggerated. And once you're in one tribe, you have to kind of mind your language around the other tribe, and that's exaggerated by social media and becomes so toxic.
A texter here says Penny Mordaunt would be more popular with the Tory membership because Rishi is too left-wing for them. I mean, it comes to something when somebody describes Rishi Sunak, a Leave voting sort of Chancellor who wants to put up taxes, or has put up taxes, as in those terms. But there we are. Everyone has to be split between left and right, and so there has to be these divisions. And I'm not sure, even in this contest, that left and right are terms that really apply, Ben.
No, it's incredibly frustrating. I think social media has a lot to do with it. I think where most people, I think, in the real world exist in the grey space between the black and white most of the time. But all you get is those, hyper kind of divided arguments. And as politicians, I don't want to plead the case for politicians, right? But you come in for some flack. I mean, I've had my wife threatened to be kidnapped. My kids have been called Nazis. Like it's ridiculous sometimes, and that's why I think I said earlier I wouldn't want to do it. The idea that you put your family front and centre of all of that, I think, is really difficult, and you have to really want to do that. But in this contest, I think it's really mixed. People would talk about, the right of the party have got to get together and the left of the party, but it's not that simple. You look at somebody like Penny, economically quite traditionally right of centre, but on cultural and social issues, she's way away from where I am on those things. So I think there is a little bit of all of it in everybody. It's about people trying to lay out what it is they believe in over the next week or so, and we'll make an informed choice.
Okay, now we'll come on to another In just a moment, it's 8:16.
LBC.
Imagine being this close to a real
LBC.
18 minutes past 8 on LBC. With me in the studio, Ben Bradley, Conservative MP for Mansfield, Richard Sefton, mental health counsellor and host of the State of Mind podcast. Tell us a little bit about the State of Mind podcast.
I speak to some people that you may know.
From Global's newsroom
about their mental health journey, their life journey, and we throw in a bit about mental health there, find out what they do to protect their mental health, how mental health has affected them. It's a different conversation with each people, with each person. I've had political commentators, politicians, singers, all sorts, and some dear friends of mine that have been through like the infected blood scandal.
That was a brilliant episode.
Mark, who's an amazing campaigner and been through so much, and it's really interesting to hear how everyone's life is completely different and which ways they turn to protect their mental health.
I think what's really interesting, when you talk to people that we all know, hearing about the trials that they've gone through in their lives sometimes, and it just shows, people always imagine that people who are famous in the media, they live this sort of gilded life, but actually they have all the same pressures that everybody else does.
Well, we forget, don't we, when we see people like those people that would have been shouting at Anna Soubry in the street, for example, there's some kind of veil. We think that these people in the media, these politicians are these comedians are superhuman and can put up with extra insults, extra pressures and stuff, and they can't. We're all human. We all deserve respect.
And you can find the State of Mind podcast on Global Player or wherever you get your podcasts. We have Iain Nadler, political commentator and author, with us, and Dane Baptiste, the comedian and podcaster. Right, time for another question. It's John in Reading. Hello, John. We've got lots of calls from Reading tonight for some reason.
It's quite a nice place.
We're big in Reading.
My question basically is, does the Conservative Party believe that the under 40s in this country have a magic money tree?
Why do you ask that?
Because it seems like no matter what I do in my life, the Conservative Party either takes away from me, they've taken away any opportunity I have of basically owning my own home because house prices are to the point excessive. They are taxing me through national insurance increase. They are either then reducing taxes in the sense of basically taking away public services. So, for example, making my streets less safe because I've got less police officers. I can't go to the NHS and get my operations if I get injured. I'm less likely to see a doctor. It just feels like you're consistently targeting my generation and saying, just grin and bear with it. And I'm living at the moment in a rental property, which is being funded by someone who's using it as a pension. So I am now basically given up on buying my own home, even though I work 7 days a week. I wake up at 5 in the morning. From my only understanding of how I am as a person, the Conservative Party hates me, and they hate the ability of me to go work for a living, and that's how I feel. Is that they just don't like under 40s.
How old are you?
32.
Right. Okay. Ben Bradley, you're under 40.
32.
You're 32. So we've got a caller who's 32, thinks the Conservative Party hates him. You represent the Conservative Party in Parliament. Do you understand why he thinks that?
I guess so. I think some of that is not generational, right? Community safety, for example, is not a generational thing. It's a real challenge. I'd say in Nottinghamshire we've got more police now than we had 10 or 11 years ago. So I battle back on some of the points there. But I think the key thing and the key cost is around the cost of living challenge we've got now, but wages and house prices, right? That's the thing that is a particularly generational problem. And I think what we've probably not got right, it's worth saying first and foremost, a lot of those challenges, pressure on the health service, there are all sorts of extraneous things that affect that, right? We've got more doctors and more nurses, but the pressure is huge and ever growing. So I don't think the Tory government have done some of those things, but we do need to address house prices, and we've not been able to do that effectively. I think partly because we all have very strong views about planning, and whenever it comes into legislation in the House, we all argue and then it gets delayed. That's a cross-party thing. But what we really need to do, I think that's about the balance in the country. I think that's an economic and a geographical balance. So we've got opposite problems in London and the South East, where prices are through the roof. We've got the opposite problem in seats like mine in Mansfield, where there aren't the jobs to sustain housing growth and the infrastructure to sustain housing growth. One is the answer to the other, isn't it? It's rebalancing the country. And I think, to be fair, although these things take a long time, that's what the PM's been talking about, actually. That's the levelling up agenda to me, creating the jobs, having the skills and the infrastructure in the places that most need it, so that you can move that pressure and rebalance that around the country. That takes a long time, though.
There was a similar situation in the late 1980s when I was kind of both your ages, where I got to the point where I thought, if I don't get on the housing ladder now, I'm never going to be able to. Did I blame the government for that at the time? I'm not sure. I did when interest rates went up to 14% or something, I can assure you. But there is this feeling, Dane Baptiste, isn't there, that young people, not just in the area of housing, lack the kind of opportunity that the previous generations did. Now, I'm not going to estimate your age, but I don't think you're over 40. So, I mean, have you gone through this similar thought process that John's going through?
I'm right there on the nose on 40, and I haven't gone through I haven't had the existential thought that I'm hated on the basis of my generation from this government, and I would want to assure John that it's not a function of hatred because of your age. We more a function of your socio-economic status as to why you may feel the government hates you, because I'd feel for people of a higher tax bracket, irrespective of age, they are able to enjoy the benefits of having their predecessors being able to avoid tax or enjoy, schemes such as non-dom status or the equity of being able to pass on generational wealth onto successive generations. The problem is that the way that the government has the infrastructure set up in this country is that house prices and cost of living have meant that you have not been able to create any wealth for yourself, and then as a result not be able to generate any subsequent generational wealth for future generations. So the issue is nothing to do with your age, it's just more to do with the age that we're living in.
Richard Sefton, that's quite an interesting point, isn't it? Because if the Conservatives want people to vote Conservatives and be pro-capitalist, you've got to have the opportunity to acquire capital, haven't you? I mean, in other words, be able to buy your own home. And in this country, we've always seen home ownership as the ultimate goal.
I'm a little bit upset that you haven't put me in the 32-year age bracket, or at least asked me.
Because I know you're not. I know you're the same age as Dane.
Exactly, right on the nose. I kind of agree with everything that Dane said then. I was thinking, I hope Iain doesn't come to me next, because I'm sitting here thinking, yeah, right on. Absolutely, it's more to do with less to do with age and more to do with where you come from. And for years I've lived paycheck to paycheck, not able to save. And I'd say that I was, in fairness, I'd say that I was like that through the Blair years, through the Brown years. I don't think it's a Conservative thing as such. However, I do feel that the Tory party cares for me less.
It's an odd thing, though, isn't it? Because for if any political party gets the reputation of hating sections of the electorate, that is not a good place to be for that political party. And the success, historically, of the Conservative Party is that it has been able to put together a wider coalition of different groups of people than the Labour Party. That's why it's been in government for so much longer than the Labour Party.
I think that going back to age, the Conservatives seem to understand that their voters tend to be of the older age bracket and maybe do more for them, to appeal more to them. So then the younger age brackets, us under 40s, would feel left behind possibly.
Well, now you're over 40, obviously you won't feel left behind. Joanne Nadler, again, throughout the decades, there's always been this thing about, well, the Tory party only cares for the rich, doesn't care for the poor. Yet you look at the record, the policy record. I mean, Margaret Thatcher, for example, what she did to allow people to buy their own homes, to encourage people to buy shares, all sorts of other things. You couldn't put that government down as a working class hating government because she got, 45% of the working class vote. Boris Johnson got 47% of the working class vote.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we've heard a lot in recent years about the Red Wall and the sort of the miracle that people said had been performed by Boris Johnson in appealing to perhaps what many people might have considered to be a non-traditional Conservative vote, and yet we'd heard, those of us who were old enough to remember, who are older than 40, unfortunately, we don't.
At least you're not 60 on Friday like me.
Well, you don't look it. Anyway, let's not get into this. No, what I was going to say is that, the Thatcherite version of that was Essex Man, really, wasn't it?
You're looking at him.
But no, to be serious about this, I actually really feel for that. Sorry, what was the caller's name?
John.
I mean, I think John actually raises a really, really important point here, and also Richard does in talking about the fact that this hasn't just happened under Conservatives. I mean, what has happened, I think, post-Thatcher is that successive governments, be they Conservative or be they Labour, have operated a very lax monetary policy. They've operated as a sort of deficit financing approach. And the corollary of all of that is that it has forced up the relative price of assets, particularly of houses. And there's a great deal of kind of tinkering around with fiscal policy when it comes to trying to make housing more affordable for people. And Ben was right. He talked about planning and making more houses available by building more houses. But that won't necessarily, I think, affect this business about how you actually afford them in terms of the affordability of loans. And the thing is that money has just been too cheap. And as I say, what's happened is it's actually made housing more expensive. And I think, there just hasn't been sufficient rigour in any of the governments that we've had really over the last 30 years particularly. And that's one of the reasons why I've been quite impressed with Kemi Badenoch, to go back to the leadership election, because she seemed to really grapple with this particular issue in her launch earlier in the week. And I felt that she's the only candidate that's really talked or alluded to monetary policy. And that's something we just don't discuss anymore.
No, because everyone falls asleep when we do. That's
the key to everything, Iain. That's the thing. Can I push back on the idea that anybody hates anybody? Because it's really frustrating. And I know there's obviously this stereotype and all the rest of it, but
but that's what he thinks.
I know, and I want to address that. But I represent one of the most disadvantaged communities in the country. You look at any tick box of things and charts you don't want to be on. My constituency is in it. It overwhelmingly voted Conservative in the last election. You can argue about whether the PM has followed through with a lot of the things he said, but he's talked about this stuff. Help to buy schemes, levelling up, creating jobs in those communities.
Yeah, but Ben, that's what I'm saying. That is tinkering around with, like George Osborne did.
Yeah, so
making loans cheaper and all the rest of it.
Let me come back to it. I think I'm going to agree with you. So the fundamental thing to me here then is the conversation about what government is for. It's incredibly frustrating when people go, the Tory government have done X. A lot of it is external. A lot of it is an economic drift that hasn't been tackled. It needs to be tackled, and it never has been. Which again, you mentioned Kemi. She's the only one in this contest who is saying, well, government is trying to do too much for too many people, and we need to get back to a place where it focuses on the things that really matter and does them well, because it hasn't, and it hasn't for decades. So until you really get to grips with that, it's not going to get fixed.
I think you're missing something. I don't think that a lot of people voted the Tory party in 2019 for this, that, or the other. It was all for Brexit.
No, I disagree.
Well, it wasn't. It wasn't all.
Brexit means Brexit.
Part of it was anti-Corbyn, obviously.
It's been happening since 1997. You look at my seat, there was an 18,000 Conservative majority in 1997. It went 15, 11, 8, 6, 5 Tory.
You mean a Labour majority?
It was a Labour majority, sorry, yes. And it drifted over 20-odd years to now a 16,000 Conservative majority. That's happened over 22 years. That's not just Brexit. That's been going on for a long time.
Right, we'll come to a question that I really think is interesting, because sometimes you just get questions on newsy things, and then you get some questions which really make you think, and the next one is one of those, but you'll have to wait a couple of minutes to hear it. Serena Farrow has the news headlines on LBC at 8:32.
There are now 6 contenders in the Conservative leadership race, as the Chancellor Nadine Zahawi and former Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt were earlier knocked out. They both failed to get the support of at least 30 Tory MPs, which is needed to progress. Rishi Sunak leads the way with 88 supporters. Penny Mordaunt came second. Party members have the final say once there are only 2 candidates remaining. 2 police officers will appear in court charged with assault following a stop and search in northwest London. It follows complaints that excessive force was used during the investigation in Hendon last December. And there's going to be another rail strike later on this month. The RMT union says its members at 13 train companies and Network Rail will walk out 2 weeks today. It's because of a row over pay and jobs. LBC weather dry and clear, particularly for southern areas tonight. Feeling cooler though, with a low of 8 degrees.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
8:35 on LBC. At the risk of this becoming the Kemi Badenoch publicity hour, I should tell you that Kemi will be here with us in the studio in the 7 o'clock hour tomorrow to take your questions and calls. As you may know, she was supposed to be here tonight, but because of the 1922 committee hustings and votes, she hasn't been able to be. We'll have Tom Tugendhat as well. That is assuming that both of them make it through the second round of voting, which takes place tomorrow. Now, with me on Cross Question, I have Ben Bradley, the Conservative MP for Mansfield, Dane Baptiste, comedian and podcaster. Dane, tell me a bit about your podcast. I know all about it because I've been on it, but tell the audience about it.
And you're a welcome guest, Iain. My podcast is Dane Baptiste Questions Everything, and the title itself works in a similar way to the Varnish, does exactly what it says on the tin. So we just try to create discourse which is free of bipartisan political jargon and free of ideology, and this allows people to have open conversation about the things that matter to them most and the things that maybe keep them up at night or pique their curiosity or interest.
It can get quite deep, can't it, as well as sometimes being very funny?
Absolutely, yeah. And, we just try to have conversations which mirror the various different centres and meanders of the human mind and consciousness, so they can be a very deep and meaningful conversation, but can also be very whimsical and sometimes borderline surreal. And we feel like by indulging everyone's narratives and perspectives, it can be very nurturing for someone's mental health to feel that they are listened to.
I think
understood.
the episode I was on was probably at the shallow end of the conversation, but there we go.
It's all down to interpretation. It's all very subjective, Ian. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and as long as you did too, that's the main thing. So.
I did, absolutely. Joanne Nadler is here, political commentator and author, and also Richard Sefton, mental health counsellor and host of the State of Mind podcast. Right, let's go to our next question. It's from James in Ayrshire. Hello, James.
Yeah, hello, Ian, and good evening to your panel. A really interesting discussion. My question is a bit counterintuitive given what I've heard from your panel so far, but I wondered if you and your panel think the concept of unity in politics is actually grossly overrated.
Why do you wonder that?
Because I think a free democratic society thrives on division of ideas. I mean, I personally have been on the losing side in the last two referenda in Scottish independence and in Brexit. I've got no intention of making common cause with Scottish Unionists or with Brexiteers, and to do so would be intellectually fraudulent. So I don't see these repeated calls, we've all got to get in it together. What the Brexiteers and Unionists won, it's your show, get on with it. You have losers' consent in a free country, United Kingdom, and that's as much as you can expect, I think.
I think this gets to the core of politics, doesn't it, Joanne, where if you're out canvassing, you can knock on one door and somebody says, you're all the same, there's no difference between you, and then you knock on the next door and they say, oh, why can't you all just get along? And in the end, you can't appeal to both of those, can you?
I completely sympathise with your caller. I think he's hit on something very important here. I think politics should be about convictions. I think it should be about people arguing from their particular perspective and making the case for the vision of the world in which they want to live. And I think that when they make that vision in an attractive way, when they make their arguments with conviction, as I say, I think, they will bring people with them, or they won't. But at least they'll be standing by the principles that they believe in. And I think we just don't hear enough of politics expressed in those terms, and we haven't heard enough of politics expressed in those terms for too long. I think the exception to that, and the reason why it caught hold of people in the way that it did, for good and for ill, were the arguments around Brexit. Which I think brought out some very sort of fundamental discussions about how we view the state and our relationship to it and things like that. But generally, I think we have a kind of a curious stasis in which there's kind of ideological conformity, and the pressure to conform becomes the overbearing pressure. And I think we saw far too much of that during the COVID period, when it became very difficult to question the government's strategy. You saw the vast majority of the media falling in behind the government's strategy. Any questioning of the fact that we were moving towards some kind of technocracy was just not held up to scrutiny, except around the edges, and if you like, the new media. So I think your caller raises an extremely important point. It's not so much just relevant for this leadership election. It's really relevant for our democracy as we choose to live in it as going forward.
Let's remind ourselves of the question: is the idea of unity in politics overrated? Because maybe politics thrives on division. Dane Baptiste.
I mean, I definitely agree with the caller, and I think it's about a larger question about the structure of our bipartisan political system. I think there's been lots of talk about majority representation at the beginning in terms of how politics kind of takes place. I think myself, speaking apolitically, I think the politics as it exists now is largely a function of capitalism, and whoever is vying for power has to contextualize their campaign, or I guess aspirations, along the lines of pleasing the people they depend on to finance their campaigns, or to maintain their power, or I guess their virtue in the eyes of, if nothing else, within the media. And so I think unity I think, unity is somewhat overrated, but I think that might be. But I think in order for politics to function as a representative of the desires and inclination of the laity, there has to be some level of moderation within there, only to an extent that you need to consider the ideology of everybody. Because if once we start going on a very slippery slope of disregarding the other side, then we can very easily sleepwalk into tyranny or autocracy.
Richard Sefton, we hear a lot about talk about the soggy centre, where sort of everyone thought, well, Blair, Brown, Cameron, Osborne, they were kind of all a bit the same. Do you think that it is better for a political system where you have people from left and right, and they express their convictions very forcibly, but that inevitably is then seen as divisive?
I didn't know if you were talking about PR then or not. Basically, again, you came to me after Dane and he said a lot of things that I agreed with. I think that healthy people disagreeing with each other is where growth happens. I think there's a place for unity. And I think there would be a natural unity if everyone was allowed to think for themselves and be themselves.
There is on Ukraine, isn't there, essentially? I mean, not just across the political parties, but I think across voters as well. I've heard very little pushback on the stance that the Boris Johnson government has adopted on Ukraine, or indeed Western governments in general. And it's not because the media has suppressed debate, as somebody will no doubt allege. There just hasn't been that kind of opposition there. Even Stop the War have been silent, thank God.
Controversially, I think we're told to think a lot of the things that we think we're told to think in the media. If we see all the same messages, then we're going to go with that message. I think earlier on somebody was saying about polling, and there was I read something the other week that if you see that somebody is polling well, then they're going to poll better, as opposed to what you would necessarily think. So I think in a lot of ways we're told what to think.
So we're all sheep.
Essentially, yeah, by human nature.
See, I don't think that is human nature.
Well, I mean, okay, sheep nature.
If all of your friends have the same view, I suspect, yes, you are likely to maybe adopt that view yourself. But I think most people have got a mind of their own.
Yeah, we're not going to, though. We're not all going to have the same view as our friends. We're all going to have slightly different views. But in Parliament, we see whole parties with the very same view, and then another whole party with the very same view. And you know that it can't be right. You know that can't be each individual person's thoughts. So there's unity there, but I think there needs to be a little bit more division in the parties, within the parties.
Ben?
I think the debate is really important. I think the most frustrating thing in politics is when there's a bit of a mess going on in the media, you get a colleague put in the WhatsApp group, can't we all just get together and unite? And it's like, right, yeah, I'll just put my values aside.
That's enough, Nadine, you say.
No comment. I think I'm elected as a politician to have a clear set of values and a view. I'm elected, in my view, because of, certainly our system is set up to be elected because of those values and views. And I'm there to represent them. I think you can't possibly keep everybody happy. And part of the problem of recent governments, I think, is if you, and I mean over decades, if you are spending your time trying to respond to media and keep everybody happy and not be in trouble, have negative newspaper headlines, you end up pleasing nobody because you don't stand for anything. And the thing that I want to see going forward is, I always refer to signposts rather than weather vanes, right? I want a clear direction. I want to know what you believe the country
just like
to be.
Tony Benn.
Oh, well, some say. I know what I know what you want the country to be, and you're going to lay out how you're going to get there. I don't want somebody who's going to change their mind every week because the Daily Mirror said something negative. And I think the sooner we get used to that, the problem with it all, of course, we talked about social media earlier on, that amplifies the either end of the conversation. You lose the debate. And I think the Ukraine's a good example, perhaps, of where it's easy to say everybody agrees. There are all sorts of challenges and issues with it. And they're not things, it's not like a media whitewash, not things you're going to see in the media. But if you talk to people on a day-to-day basis, they'll go, well, what about when these home situations are breaking down? Where do people go? What's that mean for the housing waiting list that's already got 3,000 people on it? What's that mean for my school places? So there is another side to that argument, and debate that happens face-to-face. It's not the big story, right? We all agree on the principle, I think, largely. But there's still nuance and debate to be had. And the sooner, I think, we get to a place to, not to be the Kemi advert again, but that's kind of what she said. And her view on equalities has been...
You're getting the plugs in, aren't you?
Her view on equalities has been, well, the most important thing on these really emotive issues is that we can have a proper conversation, because the reason they're so emotive is because they're really important.
Dane, you want to come in?
Yeah, I've just to be quite frank and be like, I'm very tired of hearing Kemi Badenoch's name. This is the same person who was recorded in saying that she thinks critical race theory should be illegal, and this is in the ad. This is how can a theory be illegal and then you encourage debate?
She didn't say the theory. I don't think she said the theory. I know. Teaching it as a fact.
Teaching a theory is teaching a theory.
It is illegal.
How can a theory be illegal? Do you even know what critical race theory is?
Teaching a contested theory.
Can either of you? Which is actually very easy to say when no one's been able to define it. Who seem to be critics of critical race theory. It's already being taught in Ivy League schools, so it can't be illegal because it's already taught at Harvard and Yale.
Nobody said it can't be taught, and Kemi hasn't said that. What she said is you have to lay down that this is one view and there are other views. You can't teach it as if it
those
is.
Those views already exist, and those have been exemplified by the Prime Minister when he referred to black people as pickaninnies. So that's an example as to why critical race theory needs to be taught. Or we can go back to examples of Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech.
He was actually being critical of people using that phrase. It has been misquoted.
Okay, well, Anne-Marie Morris is another Conservative MP who was recorded and saying the finding the N-word in a woodpile. We can, and that's how very easy it is to pick out multiple examples of racism from Conservative Party members. So bringing up someone like Kemi Badenoch, who very clearly has been put in a position whereby she can act and she can be a marionette on behalf of people who want her to deny the existence of racism.
That is the hypocrisy of...
No, this is called a debate.
Black woman who disagrees with me, so she's not the right kind of black...
No. First of all, that's fine because
the establishment.
Yeah, she's a marionette for the establishment because of the denied existence of critical race theory in the wake of what we saw happen in America. I'm not finished because the MP.
Hang on. I'm in control of this programme. You're not in control of this programme, Dane. I am. So let me. Are you seriously saying that Kemi Badenoch and any non-white Conservative MP or minister is just a marionette of the Conservative establishment and are being used in some way? Is that really what you're saying?
No, what I'm saying is, in referring specifically to Kemi Badenoch, in the wake of Boris Johnson's advisor quitting after the release of a race row paper which denied existence of racism in the UK, the advisor himself was also a black person who left the Conservative Party.
Well, let's actually
of that report.
Let's put on the record.
Yep. You can put it on the record.
Let's put on the record what Kemi Badenoch actually said. She was addressing MPs during a Commons debate on Black History Month, and she said the government does not want white children being taught about white privilege and their inherited racial guilt. And this is a quote: "Any school which teaches these elements of political race theory as fact, or which promotes partisan political views such as defunding the police without offering a balanced treatment of opposite views, is breaking the law." Now, that seems to me completely reasonable, Dane.
Well, to me it doesn't, because no one could give an example of a functional or logical rebuttal to the idea of defunding the police or addressing institutional racism within the police.
Nobody can give you a logical rebuttal to taking money away from people.
No one's giving it here.
I mean, just look at San Francisco. Just look at,
about San Francisco. We're not in San Francisco.
Have you ever read
in the UK? We're in the UK and we've seen revelations of institutional racism. That was proved in the McPherson
critical
report.
race theory or contemporary critical theories of race tend to come from the States. They've been imported from the States. So therefore, if you ask me to come up with a reason why we shouldn't defund the police, I would say look at very many cities now, largely Democrat cities in the US, where defunding the police has particularly affected ethnic community neighbourhoods, for instance. Where the murder rate is higher than it's ever been. I understand.
So then let's look at Uvalde, Texas, where we've increased spending. Let's look at Uvalde in Texas, where we increased spending for the police, and during a school shooting, the police did nothing, leading to the death of 20 children.
Quick final word from you, Ben.
I was going to say this gets to the heart of it, doesn't it?
That's so you can say issue which we can discuss.
Overall, you can say, look, we all must agree. Clearly, we don't. So agreeing is false, isn't it? It's not a realistic picture of the way forward.
Well, that debate just exemplifies the question from James.
And what it shows is that this conversation is really important for us to have, because if you want to try and do the most good for the most people, you have to figure out what most people kind of believe and want. And that's why this conversation can't be something that's shut down in the way that Dane's trying to do.
OK, James, thank you very much. Well, you certainly created a bit of a spark with that question. We'll come to a different one in just a moment. It's 10 to 9.
LBC, Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
The Conservatives need a new leader. We will get ourselves a new Prime Minister, and one of the people in the running is now Chancellor of the Exchequer, Nadhim Zahawi. If or when you became Prime Minister, would you offer Boris Johnson a job in your cabinet?
Boris Johnson is a friend of mine of 30 years. If he wishes to serve in cabinet, then I would certainly offer him a job. He has been probably the most consequential Prime Minister of his generation.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player, LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:53 is the time on LBC. It's Cross Question with Ben Bradley, Dane Baptiste, Richard Sefton and Joanne Nadler. Now, the next call is from Chris in Croydon. Chris, hello. What's your question, please?
Good evening, Keith. Good evening, panel. Yes, my question is...
Who's Keith? Who's Keith?
Does Keir Starmer's policy for private school taxation show that class warfare lives on in the Labour Party?
So he's announced, I think I'm right in saying, that he wants to abolish charitable status for private schools. Dane, let's start with you.
I would doubt it, being that I imagine most of the head members of the Labour Party themselves are privately educated. So I very much doubt that he would be campaigning for a direct attack on those institutions. I think class warfare is something that has been declared since austerity began in this country a very long time ago. And as we're seeing rights of workers being eroded before our very eyes and the privatisation of our healthcare service, there are so many more dangerous elements of class warfare that are taking place outside of academic institutions.
Well, he did make a speech this week, or was it last week, saying that's exactly what he does want to do, to cut the charitable status from private schools, which would mean that presumably quite a lot of them would go out of business.
I'm sure they survive.
Okay. Richard Sefton.
I'm sure they'll be fine.
You keep coming to me straight after Dan.
Well, it's obviously deliberate
side,
now.
It needs to be one after the other like that.
Oh, thanks for telling me how to do my job. Get on with it.
I think it will. I think if that were to happen, I think it would mean that more rich people would still be able to use the schools, go to the schools, and I think it would cause a bigger gap with social mobility and stuff like that. It's wrong.
At the moment, 7% of people of school age go to private schools. I think it's 615,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, if that happened, and I think it's almost inevitable, it doesn't matter what your politics is, but it's almost inevitable that a proportion of those schools would probably close. So a proportion of those 650,000 would then go to state schools, putting more of a burden on the state sector. It sounds ludicrous. So basically, Chris is right. It's a class-based issue, isn't it?
But what about putting more money into state schools instead?
What are you going to cut to do that?
Pardon?
What are you going to cut to do it?
Let's tax the rich.
Brilliant, yeah. I've heard that before.
No,
Ben.
I think it's daft. Look, they're absolutely right that if you take away the charitable status, those donations and that support is what helps with bursaries, what helps with scholarships to help. And so many of those private schools take children from the most disadvantaged communities who've academically done really well and put them on that path and help them. I've argued actually that we should help our kids who are in the care system to go into private education. It's cheaper actually than looking after them in residential care, but the outcomes are incredible. So it's a real social mobility opportunity. And as you said, Ian, if you lose thousands of children out of that private sector, where let's not forget families are paying twice, they're paying tax for our schools, but they're not using it, they're not using that resource, they're then paying again for private schools. You've got to find school places for those kids, and in the kind of communities where, the more affluent communities perhaps, where most of those would live, that's the places that have got the most pressure on school places, because they're it's where people want to live. So you would cause a huge fallout of different challenges all the way down the system if you did that. And actually, I think whether it is education or whether it is healthcare, the more you can promote people using private services, the more that relieves pressure on the services that they exist. They still pay into public services, but they don't use them, and that creates space for everybody else.
Joanne?
It does sound as if this is a move by Starmer to appeal to this Corbynite wing of his party who were committed to getting rid of independent schools. I think in the last manifesto they watered down the wording of it, but it amounted to the same thing. I mean, the only thing I would say is I think that independent schools are doing a very good job in many cases of getting rid of themselves, or at least undermining their own core purpose, because so many of them are actually going down the route of introducing things like contemporary critical theories on race and gender ideology.
Don't mention that. We've been there before.
Well, I mean, I think they've got to be very careful about observing the main principles of the Education Act and making sure that they stick with impartiality. I think some of them are bending over backwards to try to be sort of what they would consider to be contemporary or relevant, and they're in danger of actually losing their core purpose. And the reason why people who aren't necessarily on high incomes will put themselves out to put their children through these kind of schools because they're expecting a certain rigorous type of traditional education, and increasingly they're not getting it. So the sector needs to look to itself as well as complain about what politicians are doing.
How many of us went to private schools, Dane?
Oh, not me.
No, Ben?
One of each.
You went to one of each. Joanne?
Yeah, I went to an independent school which started off as a direct grant school, and then when it lost its grant, my parents decided to make the effort.
Richard?
No.
No, me,
Not at all.
me neither. Bog standard comp.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much for that question. Now, our listeners this week seem to be obsessed by karaoke. So yet again, we have a text for the end of the programme from Kathleen in Hammersmith. This week, we've learned that if Grant Shapps, Penny Mordaunt and Nadeem Zahawi went to a karaoke night, we'd hear Rapper's Delight by the Sugar Hill Gang. Which I've never heard of. I Will Survive by Gloria Gaynor, which of course I have. And These Boots Were Made for Walking by Nancy Sinatra. That was Penny's choice. I don't know what Kemi Badenoch's choice would be to that. But what would the panel be singing, asked Kathleen in Hammersmith. Joanne Nadler.
I was frightened that you were going to come to me first.
Well, there you go. I go to people always in the wrong order, according to Richard.
Well, I think I'd probably sing something by the last person I went to see in concert, who was Paul Weller a couple of weeks ago. Not sure what, but I'd choose something from the Paul Weller songbook.
I'm trying to think of one, but I can't. Dane?
Many Men by 50 Cent.
I have heard of 50 Cent, but I've never heard of the song.
Knowledge.
Ben?
So I actually sang the first dance at our wedding. So I quite
sang
liked
it?
Karaoke.
Wow.
Yeah.
Whilst you were dancing?
No, I pre-recorded it in the studio and stuff and did it all fancy.
Oh, wow.
Thinking out loud.
Don't you know at a wedding it's not about you?
Well, it is a bit. You've got to grab some glamour back, haven't you? From
Gorgeous song as well.
Nice song. But my favourite karaoke moment is in Parliament, actually. Me and Scott Mann did a fantastic version, in my own opinion, of Teenage Dirtbag that would be
During
a
PMQs?
social media hit.
Teenage Dirtbag. Who on earth sings that?
Wheatus.
Wheatus. Come on, Ian.
That's my childhood.
I'm so out of touch. Now, I haven't come to you after Dane, so
which is
surprise us with
yeah.
your wit and wisdom.
I went to see Beverly Knight the other day, so I'd probably sing one of, oh my God, she was amazing. And she name-checked me during the song. It was brilliant. I have had her on my podcast. I'm actually a singer in a band, Factory Hens, rubbish name, but, check us out. Factory Hens Band. So I'm singing all the time. My favourite song that we do is either All These Things That I've Done by The Killers or Smells Like Teen Spirit by Nirvana.
I'm going to Google that.
Right. Karaoke questions are from now on officially banned on Cross Question.
You've not heard of any of those?
I haven't heard of virtually any of those, no. I'm going to see ABBA on Friday, so I'll stick to that. Ben Bradley, Dane Baptiste, Richard Sefton and Joanne Nadler, thank you very much for joining us. In a moment, we're not going to be talking about Kemi Badenoch for the next hour, as we seem to have been doing for the last hour. We're going to be talking about Penny Mordaunt. She has made a bit of a splash, get it, in this campaign now. She came second today in the ballot of MPs, and there's another ballot tomorrow. Do you think that she is the person most likely to pull through and become the next leader of the Conservative Party and our next Prime Minister? What do you make of her so far? Because she hasn't had the highest of profiles, and I think people are finding out a lot about her for the first time. What do you make of her? 0345 6060 973. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's 2 minutes past 9.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, Jeremy Hunt and Nadhim Zahawi are out of the running to become the next Prime Minister. They failed to get support from 30 MPs to make it through the first